The flight began with a sense of calm, the hum of the engines a comforting backdrop to the quiet murmurs of the passengers. The first-class cabin exuded an air of luxury, with plush seats and carefully placed amenities, making every passenger feel special. In the midst of this serene atmosphere was a seasoned flight attendant, Hannah Bell, known for her exceptional service and precision in carrying out her duties. She moved through the aisles with ease, offering polite smiles and ensuring the comfort of the passengers who occupied the most expensive seats. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories. Among those passengers was the elderly couple, Harold and Olivia Grant, who had just boarded the plane after a long, tiresome journey. Harold, with his graying hair and wise eyes, gently helped his wife, Olivia, who was in her late 70s. Olivia's frailty showed as she carefully walked down the aisle, clutching her worn leather purse, her fingers trembling with age. She was a woman of quiet dignity, and despite her obvious weariness, there was a strength in the way she carried herself. The couple's years of life experience were written in the lines of their faces, each wrinkle telling a story of resilience and grace. Harold took his seat beside Olivia, trying to ease her discomfort after hours of travel. As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, he noticed Olivia shifting in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. She was slightly dehydrated from the long layovers and the flight, so Harold decided to press the call button and request a simple glass of water for her. He expected no issues, a minor request that should have been easily accommodated. However, the moment the call button lit up, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Hannah, who had been conversing with some first-class passengers about their plans, turned toward the Grants' row. With a perfectly practiced smile, she approached them, but her tone was anything but warm. "Sir, we have a schedule for a reason," Hannah said dismissively. "If I serve one passenger water early, others will start asking for the same. I'm sure you can wait like everyone else." Harold, a little surprised by her sharpness, gave her a polite smile and nodded, but Olivia's tired eyes betrayed her discomfort. As Hannah continued her service with barely a glance toward the elderly couple, the mood in the cabin began to shift. Whispers passed between passengers, some uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed, while others, perhaps unaware or unwilling to speak up, looked away. As the flight continued, the tension from the earlier exchange between Hannah Bell and the elderly couple, Harold and Olivia Grant, began to simmer beneath the surface. While some passengers returned to their books, tablets, or in-flight entertainment, a few couldn't help but steal glances at the couple. Olivia's discomfort was visible, her quiet sighs as she shifted in her seat didn't go unnoticed. Harold, ever the gentleman, remained composed, though his eyes held a trace of concern for his wife's well-being. He had expected a simple service, but the dismissive tone of the flight attendant had left a bitter taste. Meanwhile, Hannah moved down the aisle, oblivious to the growing tension in the cabin. Her smile remained plastered on her face, and she continued to charm the elite passengers with her impeccable service. She hadn't given a second thought to the Grants' request. After all, in her mind, they weren't important enough to merit special attention. She had worked on enough flights to know which passengers needed extra care, those with obvious wealth and status. To her, Harold and Olivia seemed just another pair of elderly travelers, perhaps not worth the effort. However, as Hannah approached a few other rows of passengers, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few passengers seemed to avoid her gaze, while others exchanged uneasy looks. It was subtle but palpable, the ripple of discontent that was spreading across the cabin. One of the flight attendants, Sienna, who had observed the earlier exchange, noticed how her colleagues' actions seemed to be affecting the mood of the cabin. She felt a slight twist in her stomach but chose not to intervene, hoping the situation would diffuse on its own. But in that moment, the consequences of Hannah's actions were already beginning to unfold. Olivia, who had been too polite to say anything earlier, now rested her hand on Harold's arm, signaling her growing discomfort. She wasn't angry, just tired, and her simple request for water had gone unmet. Harold's frown deepened, but he chose to remain quiet, recognizing that saying anything more would likely make the situation worse. Hannah, still moving through the cabin, remained blissfully unaware of the shifting dynamics around her, unaware that her small act of disregard was setting the stage for a reckoning she wouldn't see coming. The calm of the flight, once again, was shattered by a quiet but unmistakable shift. As Harold and Olivia sat in uneasy silence, the ripple effects of Hannah Bell's earlier actions began to take shape. Passengers were no longer quietly whispering amongst themselves. Now, it seemed that every eye in the cabin was on the elderly couple. The weight of the earlier dismissal was becoming apparent. It wasn't just a simple oversight, it was a disregard that carried deeper consequences. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain David Moore, a seasoned pilot with years of experience, received a message that made his stomach tighten. He had been monitoring the cabin's atmosphere, and when he received a communication about a passenger complaint, he knew exactly who the issue was about. His years of flying had given him a strong intuition, and he immediately understood the significance of this particular complaint. Olivia and Harold were not ordinary passengers, they were, in fact, the owners of the airline. It wasn't long before Captain Moore passed the message along to Senior Flight Attendant Sienna. His face was unreadable as he briefed her on the situation. "You need to handle this carefully," he instructed her, his voice firm. "The couple in 4B, the Grants, they're the owners of this airline. Do not make this worse." Sienna's heart skipped a beat. She had been hesitant to speak out earlier but now realized the full weight of the situation. She turned to find Hannah, who was still completely unaware of the gravity of her mistake. As she made her way toward Hannah's location, Sienna couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The wrong decision had been made, and now it was too late to undo it. As the flight continued, the atmosphere grew thick with tension, and the consequences of Hannah Bell's earlier behavior were now undeniable. The murmurs among passengers had escalated into hushed whispers as the truth slowly began to seep through the cabin. It didn't take long for some of the more observant passengers to realize the couple sitting in row 4B, Harold and Olivia Grant, were not your typical travelers. They were, in fact, the owners of the airline. Hannah, still walking confidently down the aisle, was unaware of the storm brewing around her. She offered drinks, chatted with passengers, and moved from one row to the next with the same air of superiority that she had carried throughout the flight. She felt no need to acknowledge the growing unease among some of the passengers. To her, her service was impeccable, and any complaints would be dismissed, as they always had been. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, and this one, Harold and Olivia, seemed like nothing more than an inconvenience. But as she approached the galley, a call came through her internal communication device. Her stomach tightened as she heard the captain's voice on the other end. "Hannah, I need to speak with you. We've received a complaint about your treatment of the couple in 4B. They're the owners of the airline." Captain Moore's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of urgency behind his words. Hannah's heart skipped a beat. The couple in 4B? The owners? She had dismissed them as just another elderly couple, and now, the realization hit her hard. She had made a grave mistake. As she walked toward the cockpit, her legs felt heavier than ever. Sienna, who had been watching the situation unfold, met her in the galley with a somber expression. "You need to apologize, Hannah," Sienna said quietly, but firmly. "This is bigger than you think." Hannah nodded, her face pale as the weight of her mistake settled in. She had been so wrapped up in the trappings of her perceived importance, so quick to dismiss those she thought beneath her, that she had failed to see the consequences of her actions. When she finally reached Harold and Olivia's seats, she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The words that had come so easily earlier now felt forced, and the weight of the moment was almost suffocating. I apologize," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I misunderstood the situation earlier. It won't happen again." Olivia, ever composed, simply nodded without a word. Harold gave her a look, his eyes sharp and unreadable. The brief exchange, although polite, felt like a cold, hard reckoning for Hannah. This wasn't just about a glass of water, it was about respect, humility, and understanding that no one, no matter their station, should ever be treated with indifference. Hannah stood there, exposed, as the once powerful feeling of control she had always taken for granted began to slip away, replaced by the undeniable truth that her arrogance had just cost her far more than a simple apology could fix. The rest of the flight passed in a tense, almost suffocating silence. Hannah Bell's mind raced as she moved through the aisles, performing her duties with mechanical precision. The weight of her earlier actions pressed heavily on her chest, and the realization that she had wronged the owners of the airline, Harold and Olivia Grant, loomed over her every move. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier exchange continued to cast furtive glances her way, some shaking their heads in disappointment, while others whispered among themselves. Hannah's usually confident stride now felt uncertain, her usual brisk pace slowed as she tried to regain some semblance of control. But she knew deep down that her reputation was crumbling around her. Her arrogance and dismissiveness had not only caused a ripple of discontent among the passengers but had now put her entire career in jeopardy. She had underestimated the power of those she thought were beneath her, and now she was facing the consequences. As the flight neared its destination, the intercom crackled to life, signaling that they were preparing for landing. Hannah's heart thudded in her chest, knowing what was coming next. The smooth hum of the engines, which had once comforted her, now felt like an ominous backdrop to her inevitable fall from grace. The moment the plane touched down, the familiar sounds of the cabin lights coming on and passengers beginning to gather their things were drowned out by the cold, harsh reality of what awaited Hannah. The same security officers who had been discreetly observing her throughout the flight now moved with purpose toward the front of the cabin. Hannah froze as she met their eyes, the understanding clear. They were there to escort her off the plane. Sienna, who had been watching the entire ordeal with a mixture of sympathy and unease, caught Hannah's gaze as she began to walk down the aisle. "You're not going to walk off this plane like you usually do," Sienna murmured softly. "You know that, right?" Hannah's stomach twisted as the truth settled in. She had failed, and there was no turning back now. The weight of her mistakes, her careless treatment of Harold and Olivia, and the deep, unspoken judgment from the passengers had already sealed her fate. As she stepped off the plane, the sharp, sterile air of the airport terminal hit her. Her hands trembled as she followed the security officers down a narrow corridor toward a private room. There was no one left to impress, no customers to serve. The once promising flight attendant, so sure of her place in the world, now felt small and insignificant. When she entered the meeting room, the faces of the airline executives greeted her, not with the warm smiles of familiar colleagues, but with cold, stern expressions. And sitting at the head of the table was Harold Grant, his expression unreadable. The reality was undeniable. Her actions had not only tarnished her career but had also shifted the balance of authority within the airline. "Why did you think they didn't belong, Hannah?" Harold asked, his voice steady, carrying the weight of someone who knew how much was at stake. Hannah Bell stood frozen, her legs heavy, as the silence in the room pressed down on her. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, guilt, disappointment, and judgment radiating from the executives sitting before her. The weight of her actions had now fully dawned on her, and the realization that she had treated Harold and Olivia Grant, owners of the airline, so dismissively was unbearable. "Why did you think they didn't belong, Hannah?" Harold Grant's voice rang out in the room, cutting through her thoughts. His calm but firm question left her struggling for words, the weight of the moment sinking deeper into her soul. This wasn't just about a simple mistake, it was a failure to recognize the very people who had built the airline, and now her career was on the line. Hannah swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. I didn't mean to," she faltered, the words feeling hollow in her throat. How could she explain what had happened when there was no good reason for her actions? The truth was, she had allowed her biases to cloud her judgment, ignoring the very principles of respect and professionalism she had sworn to uphold. The room remained deathly quiet, the other executives looking at her with disapproving expressions. Olivia Grant's gaze was particularly piercing, disappointment written all over her face, but no anger. She had already seen enough to understand the real problem. "Your behavior was not only unprofessional," Olivia said softly but firmly, "it was a direct violation of the values this company stands for." Hannah's heart raced as she tried to maintain her composure. Her eyes flicked nervously to the floor, unable to face them fully. "I've worked hard for this job," she began, her voice shaking. "I never intended to hurt anyone." "You didn't just hurt someone, Hannah," Harold interrupted. "You endangered the very foundation of the trust our airline is built on. This is about respect, respect for every passenger, regardless of their status." Hannah's stomach churned, her mind racing as she realized how irrevocable the situation had become. Her actions had been a catalyst for change, a catalyst that she couldn't undo. The executives exchanged glances, their decision already made. "Your actions will be documented," James Caldwell, the vice president of operations, spoke up, "and this will be used as a case study for all future training. You're no longer part of this team." The finality of his words hit Hannah like a freight train. The world she had carefully built was slipping away. As she was escorted out of the room by security, she knew there was no turning back. She had not only lost her job but had also learned the most painful lesson of all: respect isn't earned by title, but by actions. As she left the building, the reality of the situation settled deep within her. She had lost everything, and the weight of that realization would stay with her forever. The sterile airport terminal seemed to stretch endlessly before Hannah Bell as she walked down its long corridors, escorted by 2 security officers. The hum of activity around her, the footsteps of rushing passengers, the low murmur of voices, felt distant, as though the world had continued moving without her. She was no longer part of that world, no longer a flight attendant with authority or pride. She had been reduced to a cautionary tale. As they reached the doors leading to the employee exit, Hannah's mind raced. She had always believed that her position was untouchable, that her years of experience, her sharp efficiency, and her unwavering commitment to protocol had earned her the right to determine who deserved respect. But today, that belief had been shattered. She was escorted to a bench near the exit, her body slumping with defeat. The airport lights overhead seemed to amplify the silence around her, and she realized that everything had changed in the span of a single flight. Every face she passed, every passing glance, seemed to echo with judgment. She had thought she understood authority, how it worked, how to maintain it. She had thought that power came from rigid control, from the ability to impose rules. But now, she saw the truth. Authority was not about dominance. It was about the ability to empathize, to recognize the humanity in every person, regardless of their background or appearance. She had failed to do that with Harold and Olivia Grant, and in doing so, had lost everything. Her phone buzzed in her hand, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from her former colleague, Mira Dawson, the one person who had tried to warn her. "Hannah, I know you're going through a lot, but this could be your turning point. You have a chance to do better." Tears filled her eyes as she read Myra's words. The truth was, Hannah didn't know what came next. Her career was over, and the damage to her reputation was irreparable. But something stirred deep within her, a glimmer of hope, a spark of realization. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe, in time, she could rebuild herself, not as the woman who held power over others, but as someone who had learned the true meaning of respect. As the door to the outside world opened, the cool breeze of the evening hit her face. She took a deep breath, knowing that though her journey in the airline industry had ended, her life was still hers to shape. The days that followed felt like a blur to Hannah Bell. The world around her seemed indifferent as she moved through the motions of a life she no longer recognized. The sleek, polished terminals she once walked through as a proud flight attendant now felt like alien spaces. The familiar faces she'd once greeted with a smile had been replaced with strangers, and the weight of her mistake was like a shadow that never left her. Her career in the airline industry, once marked by years of unblemished service, was over. Her actions had not only cost her job, but they had reshaped her understanding of power, authority, and respect. She had learned the hard way that true leadership wasn't about enforcing rules or maintaining control, it was about understanding, compassion, and fairness. Hannah spent the next few weeks in relative silence, grappling with the consequences of her actions. She knew the damage was deep. Her name would forever be linked to the moment she dismissed Harold and Olivia Grant, an incident that would be used as a case study in every training session, a stark example of what happens when authority is misused. But as the shock of the ordeal began to subside, she started to reflect on what she could learn from it. The regret she felt wasn't just for losing her job, it was for the way she had treated people who didn't fit her narrow view of importance. Harold and Olivia were not just any passengers. They were the owners of the airline, something Hannah hadn't known when she turned them away so coldly. It was a bitter realization that the very passengers she dismissed had the power to change her life, but it wasn't their wealth or status that mattered, it was the lesson they had unintentionally taught her about humility. Hannah knew she couldn't undo the past, but she also knew she couldn't move forward without learning from it. She reached out to a former colleague, Mira Dawson, who had once been sympathetic to her struggles. Myra's words of encouragement echoed in her mind: "You can choose to let this break you, or you can let it change you." In that moment, Hannah realized that perhaps the true test of her character wasn't in the job she lost, but in how she chose to rebuild herself. Weeks had passed since the incident with Harold and Olivia Grant, and Hannah Bell had started to face the harsh reality of her new life. The familiar clink of the seatbelt signs, the soft hum of engines, and the humdrum of airline schedules were no longer a part of her world. Instead, she found herself navigating through a maze of uncertainty and self-reflection. Her reputation was tarnished. The moment her actions were brought to light, it seemed like everything she had worked for was instantly dismantled. The calls from former colleagues had dried up. Even those who had once called her a mentor or a friend seemed to have distanced themselves, unsure of how to deal with her fall from grace. The regret she felt was suffocating. Yet, through the fog of embarrassment and anger, a tiny spark of clarity began to emerge. She realized that she could not hide forever. She could not remain trapped in a past mistake, haunted by the whispers of those who had witnessed her error. For all the shame she had accumulated, there was still a chance to rebuild her life, not through running away, but through facing the consequences and learning from them. Hannah had always been proud of her meticulous work ethic, but now she had come to understand that success wasn't just about performance, it was about understanding the people she served. It was about seeing beyond a name tag, a uniform, or an itinerary, and recognizing the humanity in every passenger she came across. She made the decision to reach out to Harold and Olivia, not to beg for forgiveness, but to express genuine regret for her actions. She had to own her mistake. It wasn't easy, but the phone call was the first step towards taking accountability. The conversation was awkward, but it was honest. She explained how her actions had been a product of her own biases, her focus on appearances, and her assumption that power lay in protocol and status. Surprisingly, Olivia's voice was calm. "You'll learn from this, Hannah. I can see that you're truly sorry. That's what matters," she said. "But this is a reminder that the real work is always in how you treat people, no matter who they are." That simple line was a turning point. It was the first time Hannah realized that true growth comes not from avoiding mistakes, but from accepting them and using them as tools to become better. With a newfound sense of humility, she made a promise to herself that the next chapter in her life would be defined not by her past mistakes, but by her ability to evolve from them. It wasn't the end of her career. It was just the beginning of a new journey. In life, true leadership and success are not determined by titles or authority, but by how we treat others. The story of Hannah Bell teaches us the power of empathy and respect for every person we encounter. It's easy to fall into the trap of judging others based on appearances or status, but this mindset can lead to missed opportunities for growth and connection. When we forget the humanity of those around us, we not only risk damaging relationships but also tarnish our own reputation and integrity. Hannah's journey serves as a powerful reminder that mistakes are part of life, but the real lesson lies in how we respond to them. Growth comes not from avoiding error but from learning, taking accountability, and striving to do better. Every person deserves respect, regardless of their position or circumstances. By embracing humility and recognizing the importance of treating others with dignity, we can reshape our lives for the better. If you enjoyed this story and found value in the lesson it teaches, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the bell for more inspiring content.